Hopefully, hopefully this is live. It's supposed to be. My eCam here is saying live. So welcome to another edition of the Cocktail Apocalypse. I'm
Woohoo!
Nick Mather, and I am joined, as usual, by my very dear friends Jeremy Anderson and Stephanie Buday. So, Stephanie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing peachy.
How are you?
Ready to
Good.
ready to get into the discussion on education apocalypse.
And Jeremy, how are you?
I'm overeducated and underemployed.
Hey, me too. And drowning in debt.
Right, right.
Woohoo! The
Yeah.
American dream.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, student loan debt's something I wanted to talk about, but a little bit later. Um, I thought first we could talk a little bit about just kind of education in general. Um,
Hmm.
and um, and some of the issues because we titled this education apocalypse, and there have been ongoing issues with the American education system. And maybe some of the I think that what I'll do is I'll just kind of start going through some of the issues.
Yeah.
One is there seems to be a failure, and this is not anything new. I think people think this is
Mm.
new, but the average reading level of the average American is sixth grade.
Hmm.
So we're talking about, like a reading level of an 11-year-old.
Hmm.
When I first started, after I graduated high school, I went into journalism before I got into the very lucrative field of philosophy and religious studies. I remember that we were told that we had to write to like a third grade reading level,
Hmm.
so that people could actually understand. And that's just kind of in general. And I was horrified then.
Right.
And it's not that the reading level has gone from third grade to sixth grade, but that,
Right.
the average is about a sixth grade. And that's not necessarily unique to the United States. My
Right.
understanding is the UK is kind of about the same, on that level. We also have a ongoing teacher shortage in the United
Hmm.
States. There's also a crisis in the UK going on. Theirs has different causes. Um, Here, part of the reason there's a lot of reasons. One is just pay, and I
Yeah.
this is one of the statistics that I should have looked up, and I didn't. Was that the teacher pay is pretty low for
Yes.
the amount of work
Hmm.
that they put in.
Hmm.
I know that there's this stereotype of, well, why are you complaining? Get all summer off. But they don't take into account that the school day ends for kids like 3:30 or something, but teachers have meetings after that. They've got class planning. They have
Hmm.
to put the materials together. They've got grading. All of this stuff that they have to take into account.
Right.
So their
And,
days are just kind of, they're overwhelmed.
and I think you have to also look at, that summer off is usually them spending time doing courses because they have to maintain their teacher's certificate, their
Right.
teacher's
Right.
license.
Yeah.
So a lot of that is them doing, uh, you know, graduate work or college work, um, just to maintain that license, and that takes a lot of time and energy out of them, and it's
Yeah.
mandated in many states, I believe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Um, One of the statistics I found in terms of the teacher shortage, and it's interesting, you can go on YouTube and you can find video after video after video of teachers um, talking about why they left teaching.
Hmm.
Hmm.
But one of the statistics I found, this is from a 2022 ed working paper, um, by Tuan Nguyen, Lam Chan, and Paul Bruno. And this information was retrieved from the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. But that there are at least 36,000 vacant positions um, along with at least 163,000 positions being held by underqualified teachers. And they make a point saying this is a conservative estimate.
Yeah, I believe that.
Right.
Yeah. And so, people don't go into it, one, because of the amount of work, or they get into it and then they leave because of the amount of work and stress, and the pay. And we know that teachers aren't paid that well, right?
Right.
So we also have, and some of this is being blamed on the pandemic, but not all of this can be blamed on the pandemic.
Right.
But there is a lot of behavior issues with students. This is one of the things that I see teachers talking about online, is that the students now just show blatant disrespect to the teachers in the classroom. And the students clearly don't want to be there. And this is where there's a connection to the pandemic in a sense.
I think it started long before the pandemic.
I agree. I agree. And things that I've heard, I can't imagine. From my school experience, I couldn't imagine anyone in my class in any of my classes just openly insulting an instructor.
Right.
So there's a lot of behavior issues. There's also, and this is, I'm sorry, Jeremy, did you have?
I was just going to say behavior issues with the students, but also with their parents.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also apparently chronic absenteeism, both with students and teachers, because the teachers are like, I just can't do this today, man. I can't do this.
Yeah.
But the students just aren't showing up as they're supposed to. But again, a lot of people blame that on the pandemic, but in at least K through 12 in the U.S., this was already, we were leveling downward, like Stephanie said. We were leveling downward before the pandemic. Some of the issues too is with some of the policies that have been implemented. And I've got a history here of somewhere. I've got a history of the Department of Education. At least I thought I did. Maybe I don't. But there had to be some kind of. There's been an attempt to implement a kind of national curriculum.
Right.
Because, and this has been going on since the 1800s. The Department of Education was founded in 1979. So that would have been during the Carter administration. So yes, here's the information I have. And I'll read this. I think I got this off. This may have been from Wikipedia. But Congress created the first Department of Education in 1867. Before that, education was all local. It was just small communities, and sometimes it was church-based as well. And this early Department of Education, their sole purpose really was in collecting statistics about the schools and looking at what are called today best practices, right? So looking at teaching methods, organization of the schools and whatnot. But the department was downgraded to an office the following year, so 1868. And that's where it was. It was just an office. It eventually wound up inside the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And that department was created in 1953.
Okay.
And so the offices of education, its role was fairly small until the late 1950s. And what really prompted a massive change was when the Soviets launched Sputnik. And people are like, hey, We
Yeah.
better get some smart Americans here so that we can compete.
Right.
All right. Um,
Yeah, I thought it was Kennedy, right?
yeah.
Who started a much stronger, robust national program to address the fact that the United States was actually performing behind
Hmm.
um, a lot of other nations in math and STEM,
Right.
Right.
and he wanted to, you know, level up
Hmm.
what we were
Right.
doing here, and the only way to do that was to go from a um, regional based education to a national
Yeah.
based education to get us working with the rest of the world.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And Johnson carried that forward, of course, after
Mm-hmm.
the Kennedy assassination. So what we had was the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act in 1965. And this was part of Johnson's Great Society vision.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that what that did is that increased the amount of federal aids to schools. And this is also kind of when, I mean, student loans have a little bit more of a history, but this is really when the student loan program began. And initially, student loans were offered at zero interest.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, and college costs were way lower back
Yep.
then. In 79, Congress split off the Office of Education and made, from health and education and welfare. And that's when the Department of Education was implemented. And the Department of Education isn't really about the standards, it isn't really about the
Mm-hmm.
curriculum, it's about the funding. And what they do is they provide grants to help local public K through 12 schools, specifically to help disadvantaged and disabled students and to assist low and middle income college students, in theory.
In theory.
And it funds work study programs, rehabilitative services, school improvement efforts, and education research, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's the Department of Education.
Right.
But we have had some laws implemented via Congress in our lifetime. And the one that I think most people, I'm not going to go back, throughout the history of all of this, but the
Right.
one that I think we most of us remember, and it's really wild for me to think that this is like 23 years ago now. But in 2002, under Bush, the No Child Left Behind.
Mm-hmm.
And what I seem to remember that emerged out of that was, you have the Department of Education that's funding schools, but then you had Congress saying, especially some conservatives in Congress saying, okay, well, we need to make sure that we're getting our money's worth. So how are we
Right.
going to make sure that this money is being wisely implemented? How do we
Right.
know that it's leading to the results that we want? And this isn't, necessarily irrational. But this is what they're like, okay, well, we're just going to test the students.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And teachers then began teaching to the tests.
Right.
And at that point, it's just kind of like memorization, I
Mm-hmm.
think, in terms of what they're doing. And I don't
Yeah.
think that teaching to the test is teaching. That's not an education.
And
Right.
it's not a good measure
Mm-hmm.
of much. Yeah,
Right.
it's and I might be getting a little ahead of us, but this teaching to the test, the way that it's working, a lot of this had to do with moving from an idea that education was for everybody and a common good to a
Right.
commodification.
Yes.
of education. And when you commodify things, now you're looking at your metrics, you're looking at what money is it bringing in, it's not actually working to the public good for the education of the population.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's looking towards the bottom line, it's looking towards
Hmm.
money. And
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think that is, what we call it is the neoliberalization of education. And this, started in the late 70s, but it really picked up under the Clinton administration. I think we have to be fair about that. Uh, Neoliberal policies became prolific throughout every aspect of our life, education being only one of those.
Could we talk a little bit about what neoliberalism is for those of us who don't really know? Or
Yeah.
are we not just some base points?
Well, it's basically the commodification of whatever
Okay.
thing you're looking at. In this case, it's education.
Okay.
Using it,
Okay.
and some of the aspects of it would be like moving from moving from the public to privatization.
Okay.
Um, Charter schools are part
Hmm.
of the process.
Voucher
This
system.
voucher system, teaching to the test, using these um, these tests as measures, as metrics for whether a school deserves more money,
Right.
whether they're going to be cut off from money. And so it undermines the public
Yeah.
good. It undermines, it undermines equity.
Mm.
Right. Right.
People in more disadvantaged areas now sink further down, while more
Hmm.
affluent areas get raised up. So
Right.
I'm sorry, Stephanie. We are no longer allowed to discuss anything involving diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. Right. You've
that's
just
all
got to
right. I
just put us
yeah
on a short list.
Yeah.
yeah.
But no, you're absolutely right, and I think that this is something that we've lost sight of, and I don't even know that we ever necessarily. I mean, we did in a sense. The first person that I know of to actually talk about a public education system was Thomas Jefferson.
Hmm.
Mm,
And, it was understood that for a democracy to work, you had to have educated citizens.
Right.
And so education was seen as part of the democratic process. And like you said, Steph, as the common good.
Right.
mm,
Now, the education system, you were talking about neoliberalization, and I have a few things to add to that, but I think
mhm,
that we actually need to take it back even further to the advent of the Industrial Revolution.
Oh.
yeah.
Because the way the model of education was that students were trained
Mm.
to become factory workers, essentially.
Mhm,
And the way the education was structured is, the students had to be docile, they had
Hmm.
to be agreeable, they could only do what they were told to do by some kind of authority. If they wanted to talk, they had to raise their hand. There was only ever one right answer. They really couldn't challenge what the
Hmm.
teachers were saying. They were lined up in nice little rows. When you get to
mhm,
high school, you have your classes that have a short amount of time until the bell rings. And that kind of the underlying assumption to that was that nothing is really worth paying attention to more than 50 minutes
Right.
at a shot. Um, and, this was all predicated not necessarily to educate people, but to train people for a 9 to 5 workday,
Hmm.
yeah.
and to be, you know, work in a factory. And so, I think that has been underlying a lot of our education system in the U.S. But there's this bigger question that you kind of touched on at the very beginning, and it's well, what does it act? There's what does it mean to be educated? How
Right.
do we actually teach people how do we actually teach students? And this is something I have personally struggled with for a long time. I'm a career educator. Stephanie, you've spent most of your career in education, and
Mhm.
now you're doing training. And Jeremy, you've been involved in the education system as well.
Hmm.
And I always, I kind of take it back. One of the first things I do, and I should actually, I'm going to get up and I'm going to grab this because this just occurred to me. So I'm going to go away for a minute. But when I teach Introduction to Philosophy, the first thing I have students talk about is, what is education for?
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, and I think if we take it back much further than the industrial, education was really much more for the elite,
yeah,
um, and but it was not geared towards work. It was not geared towards um, how you would be able to support yourself later. It was
yeah,
geared towards
Right.
the
Right.
idea of educating you on whatever subject matter that you were, passionate about or and excelled at. And if the idea was that your profession might become a byproduct of that, but it wasn't the end purpose of it.
right,
And
Right.
now it's all about, well, you get a degree, then you get a job,
yeah,
Right.
and you work in that industry. I don't know, probably for the rest of your life. But it's not geared towards actually learning
right.
stuff independent of what sort of um, job you might get.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab something real quick. So you two keep talking. I'll be right back. Um,
Right. So
Yeah,
another
go
sorry.
ahead.
I
Go
was
ahead.
just going to say, so another aspect of neoliberalism, in a way, might be the commodification of students themselves.
Oh yeah, yeah. I would
They, they
100% agree with that.
So education became an assembly line to produce people, which is not quite the same thing as producing people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get your meaning from that. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
like uh, now you've gotten your degree in accounting, or and you're basically um, educated on what a business uh, would want from an accountant,
Right,
and maybe you'll go on to start your own business in accounting, but
right,
the foundation of how you're taught is how you can then implement this within a corporate or business aspect.
right.
Um, you
And the
know,
irony is that the people that come through our education system now always complain that it didn't teach them what they needed to do their jobs.
yeah, and I find that fascinating. But it's like each job, each company has their own idea of what that looks like,
Right.
and it's not necessarily universal. But when you're in school, you're kind of taught like it is.
Hmm.
But things change over time.
Right.
You have to adapt to new technologies,
Hmm.
and that's not always taught.
Right.
Like what. So when you get into the job, you're expected to already know and be adaptable and all sorts of things that you're not necessarily taught in the school, anyways.
Right. Right. Yeah. One of my experiences is my undergraduate degree was in architecture.
Mhm.
And I was going through school at the time when computers were really starting to pick up, and computer aided drafting became a thing. But we were
Mhm.
taught in school to use drafting boards, pencils, papers, rulers, etc.
Mhm.
And so when I got out of school, I didn't have the skill set needed that architectural firms were looking for because I had no experience with CAD.
mm,
Mhm.
So that's part of that technology portion. Things you need a certain amount of adaptability to spin that in a way to become employable, or the system needs to keep up with what's going on in the outside world.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, and there's also like that portion of things are going to change, things are
Hmm.
always changing, isn't necessarily what's put in, what is put into
Right.
that curriculum, and we don't
Hmm.
necessarily have the ability to adapt as quickly
Right.
as everything's changing.
Right.
Um,
Because they're taught a specific set of skills that may or may not apply, but not an understanding of how to adapt to new situations. Or, yeah.
and what we're also seeing is those who are more adaptable are the more successful people
Right.
out there. Um, but they're not always given the tools, even in their
Hmm.
companies,
Right.
for how to succeed with that
Hmm.
need to be adaptable. There's a certain expectation. You graduated, you ought to know this, and if you don't, you might be, you know,
Right. Or the
cycled
adaptation they're
out.
expecting is that they expect you to adapt to their system and not be flexible in their approach to that system.
Hmm.
Well, I want to say that there's kind of getting back to this question of education in general, but I want to
Hmm.
make a distinction between education and training for a job.
Aha.
Because the skills that you needed to be an architect,
Hmm.
is that really education or is that training?
Right. And a lot of
Right.
in theory, I would say that's education. The 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 skill in computer aided drafting is a skill. That would be
Right.
training.
Yeah. So, but what is, this is the question, what is education?
Right.
And I always take this, and excuse me, Stephanie, I know before we recorded, you mentioned that you may end up on a rant. And I think that what's going to happen is I'm the one that's going to rant a little bit. Um, but going back to this question that I ask my philosophy students is what is education for? I have them read a couple things. And one of the things that I have them read is Plato's Allegory of the Cave.
Hmm.
And the reason being is that often in philosophy classes, the allegory of the cave is read through the lens of metaphysics, of, that Plato's talking about, reality, what is real.
Hmm.
But it is also something that can be read as an analogy for education,
Mm.
right? So that,
Hmm.
you have the prisoners in the cave who think, and they've got, the blinders on and they're bound to their chairs. And, all they see are the shadows in front of them, and they mistake those shadows for what's real. And often the way that the allegory is presented is that one of the prisoners frees themselves. But that's not what Plato says. Someone has to come in and free the prisoner. Someone
Mm.
physically has to come in, and this is the teacher. And the teacher then has to kind of remove the blinders and unmove the binds and get the prisoner and turn them around so that they can see actually the fire behind them and the things that are casting the shadows on the walls. And so, in a sense, education is a sort of turning, it is a turning around, right?
Hmm.
And um, Plato actually says, the education is not like putting sight into blind eyes. So it's not about just filling someone's head with facts,
Right.
right? It is more about allowing the person themselves to be able to reflect and to think critically. And what I always love about this is that, the way that the allegory of the cave is often presented is that, the prisoner then is like, oh, okay, groovy. Ooh, I see this light out at the end. I want to go and see what's out there. That's not what Plato says. Plato
Hmm.
says that the prisoner prefers the shadows.
Yep.
They
Hmm.
prefer what they know, and they have to be dragged out of the cave.
Yeah.
And as a career
Hmm.
educator, that's what it feels like. You're dragging this person out of the cave, right? And
Yep.
then
Yeah.
they have this, like, this is, source of knowledge and whatnot. But I always like that because it does bring up this question of, well, what is educate? And I like that idea that that it's a turning, but
Hmm.
it's
Mhm.
not putting sight into blind eyes. And so that then to me is like, okay, well then how do I educate students? What is
Right.
the best approach? And where I've come at, and I'm kind of surprised that I ended up here, is that increasingly I have become so frustrated as a college professor because I feel like by the time I get the students, it's too late,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Um, you know this as well as I do that it's not until they get to college that they have a critical thinking course here, and
Right.
Yes, right.
and by I am 100% with you on that. By the time they get to college, it's too late to teach them critical thinking. They are very set in their ways.
Yeah,
There's a lot of resistance, and those who aren't set in their ways have always been like that. They've been more
yeah,
malleable to new ideas that come forth. But yeah, critical thinking at the college level isn't going to cut it. It has to come much sooner at age appropriate
yeah,
stages of teaching
Hmm.
them. And that's just simply not happening.
right.
There's what I've
Right.
found is a complete lack of curiosity about their world.
Yeah.
I taught. Um, I taught in the community colleges and some private schools for higher ed from 2008 until 2020. And just getting a lot of people to just engage with the topics
Mm.
Hmm.
was very difficult thing to do. You know, um, role exercises and such were viewed skeptically. No one really wanted to engage in them. And I could recall very clearly in one of my classes, I believe it was for ethics, a student told me um, the very first day, I don't like to think.
Wow.
And I sat there and was like, okay, how do I respond to this? I'm like, this might not be the course for you because it is a
Right.
philosophy course in which thinking will be the prime thing that you have to do.
Right.
Hmm.
And I tried to incorporate her, make her feel welcome, but she ended up dropping the next week. But
Wow.
yeah, you're exactly right with that struggle. Pulling them out of the cave
Yeah.
is a perfect metaphor for what education is like right now, and maybe it always was. It's just the dynamic has changed in who goes to
Yeah.
school
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Exactly.
why they're there.
Yeah. And there are so many things I want to say. One is, I also teach ethics, and the issue that I'm having, I've been teaching it online, and I have
Mhm.
become completely disillusioned with online instruction
Yeah.
because students now are just relying on AI.
Yeah.
And I have that in an ethics class. And I literally flunked 3/4 of the class a couple years ago because all of their responses were AI generated. And I'm like, this is essentially cheating. This is plagiarism. And this is an ethics class. And I
Hmm.
cannot give you credit for this. And I will just
Mhm.
say this is how bad it is. I had, so I have students, I'm teaching ethics again. I just had to share this because so many things. Um, one of the things we do in ethics, we look at virtue theory, right?
Right.
And so one of the discussions I have is I try to tie it to being a citizen.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
as a republic, virtue is supposed to be important. And Benjamin Franklin had a list of virtues, and he is the model for like the self-made person in the United States. And he always
Right.
attributed his success to his practice of virtue. And he had this list of virtues that he would practice. So I actually have students like, okay, so if you were to do something similar, what virtues do you think would be important for you? What virtues would you like to practice and why? And I had two students that gave the exact same answer. And they said that it started out, it's like, well, I'm a mother of four children, and this is so important to me. I even named my one of my daughters Patience, but I spelled it differently, right? And so I saw this, and I'm like, two students, identical answers. And one of the students, I mean, notice here it was, I'm a mother of four. One of the students' name was Pedro, which is a male name. So I actually had to say, like, look, I can't give either of you credit for this. And the female student responded to me with her daughter's birth certificate. And so this other student in an ethics class just copied off something and pasted and said, yeah, that's fine. No one will ever notice.
Wow.
This is what we're looking at. So there's that, and then AI, and yeah.
To be fair, they were doing this before AI. I mean,
No, this was just like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I understand for you, but they've been doing this much longer, is what I'm
Oh, I see. I
saying.
see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah.
They,
Okay.
they. I had a student who, uh, they were copying off the internet. It wasn't AI, so it was like they stole someone's,
That's what I thought was
and
happening.
they stole someone's dissertation. You
Yeah.
know, and it's like, okay, this is supposed to be a one paragraph response, and you just gave me a 100-page dissertation on the wrong topic.
Yeah.
It's like, um, yeah,
Yeah. Well,
I
but
have some questions.
I have a lot of questions. I've been posting for like 20 years now on Facebook, my dear student posts.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
But I kind of want to go back to this question of what is education for again, because the second thing that I have students read in conjunction with Plato's Allegory of the Cave is this essay by David Orr.
Mhm.
And it's called, What is Education For? 6 myths about the foundations of modern education and 6 new principles to replace them. Now, I want to point something out because, again, I'm going to rant here a little bit. So I'm going to read a direct quote because this is always misattributed. And I have a video, so whenever I see this misattributed, I just paste a link to my video about this. But one of the quotes in his essay here, let me see if I can find it. I just lost my page. Yeah, so this is a quote from this article, from this essay, that's always misattributed. And it's misattributed to the Dalai Lama, but the Dalai Lama did not write this. David Orr wrote this. The plain fact is that the planet does not need more successful people, but it does desperately need more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of every shape and form. It needs people who live well in their places. It needs people of moral courage, willing to join the fight to make the world habitable and humane. And these needs have little to do with success as our culture has
Mhm.
defined it.
Yep.
All right. So and this is what I had to jump up to get. I'm like, oh, why didn't I get this? As I was putting together the notes. So I just wanted to very quickly kind of run through his 6 myths of education. So
Okay.
this is what education is not for. And please, kind of jump in, respond. First myth: ignorance is a solvable problem.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm. Okay.
He says it is not a solvable problem. Ignorance is part of the human condition. But I think that's important
It
because,
is.
it's, I always, I like how Thoreau says it, we should remember well our ignorance.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
It goes for every person, right?
Yeah.
At some point, we don't have the understanding or the broader picture to really understand what's actually happening at any given
Yeah.
Right.
time, or the answer. I
Right.
think
Right.
I think I think that flows into the idea that everything has an answer, that like
Yes,
Right.
one
exactly.
correct right answer. And
Mhm.
no, that's not true, right?
Yeah.
So we're all in that cave, you
Yeah.
know.
Right. Even if you simplify it in a certain way and say there's subjects that we're ignorant on. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's quantum mechanics. If you talk to me about quantum mechanics, I can pretend I understand, but do I really? No. You
Yeah.
know.
Well, I always like an analogy that Terence McKenna actually used once was, the bigger the more fire there is, the more darkness is exposed.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the
That's
more
a
we
good one.
know, the more we know what we don't know,
Right.
you know. So yeah, so that's the first
Yeah,
myth. Ignorance.
what was it Socrates? I know nothing.
Yeah, the only thing I know is that I do not know.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good approach to take. I mean, I know a
Right.
lot of stuff, but it's always like, I would always tell students, especially with the religious studies courses, because I kind of took a historical approach, was that, one archaeological discovery can change absolutely everything I'm telling you.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
So our knowledge is constantly changing, and
hmm
science is not a fixed thing. Science is a process, and
Right.
it is always open to being wrong, because if
hmm
it's not scientific.
Right.
Yeah, and I also hear a lot of people like blasting that. Like if something changes, it's like, well, I guess you don't know everything, do you?
Yeah.
Like it's an
Right.
accusation.
Yeah.
And it's
hmm
like, no, I don't. And neither
Right.
do you, and neither do any of us. Things change as we get more information,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
as we come to different and new understandings.
Right. And the difference is that some people pretend they know everything, but some people know they don't know everything. And I think that goes back to this idea of ignorance.
Yeah.
Again, is
Yeah.
being important to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. All right. Second myth. With enough knowledge and technology, we can manage planet Earth.
Ah,
uh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I've been studying a lot on, I study a lot on climate change and
Mm-hmm.
such. And one of the great myths is that technology is going to save us. But if we
Yeah.
look back historically, technology is usually the problem, you
Yeah.
know,
hmm
and it never actually comes out to save anybody. It just exponentially creates a bigger mess.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, there's always unknown consequences. And now that I read this, I've
Mhm.
been teaching. I taught this past year at the Colorado School of Mines, which is,
Mhm.
one of the main engineering colleges in the nation. And all their incoming freshmen have to take this course. It's called Nature and Human Values, and it's a great class. It's a mix of writing and environmental ethics, and I've learned a lot while teaching the course. But now I'm like, oh man, I should have had them read this,
hmm
because they are so focused on the technological
Right.
Mhm.
answers. However, I have challenged that in a lot of different ways. That the technologies, humans are pretty bad at determining consequences
Right.
because
Mhm.
we just don't know. And
hmm
so there have been, not necessarily this directly, but there have been ways that they've had to think about the consequences of technology, and that
hmm
Mhm.
technology is useful and it's helpful and we need it, but it can't solve everything,
Right.
Mhm.
right? And it's not free from value.
hmm
I think that's the important thing. It's not free from value. Um, but yeah, what Orr says is, we can't manage planet Earth. What we might be able to manage is ourselves
Right.
and, human desires, our economies, our politics, and our communities,
Mhm.
but not Earth.
Right.
You know. All right. Third myth. I always like this one. Knowledge is increasing, and by implication, human goodness.
Wow, yeah, that's a great one.
Do people actually
Uh-huh.
believe that? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, they think that knowledge equals wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
no,
my
not so
gosh.
much, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's knowledge can make us, there's a lot of hubris that can come with that, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
yeah, it could produce some wisdom, maybe, if depending on each person, but mostly it produces some form of hubris that
Mm-hmm.
blinds us to the
Hmm.
problems going on.
Yeah.
I keep thinking of Vonnegut, who Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote about World War II, saying that because the enemy was so bad, we thought that we were that good by
Right.
comparison. It's like the equal opposite of that,
Mm-hmm.
when that has nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
I mean, just because they're worse doesn't make anyone else better by default.
Right.
Right.
And I think we get that idea that progress means more wisdom and more
Hmm.
understanding, and we move forward. And I don't see that as being true.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. What Orr talks about here in this section, and it's odd that I don't know. It seems like it's a little bit misplaced, perhaps. Um, but what he talks about is the while some knowledge increases, other knowledge decreases.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And that, so for example, there are, even in the sciences, we see this transformation where there is, like right now, students are like, yeah, I want to go into AI, man. That's where it's all at. But there are other aspects that are now abandoned,
Right.
and so that's a loss of knowledge,
Hmm.
because it's seeing
Yeah,
like it's not valuable anymore.
Right.
yeah. AI is a great example of that, because there's the idea of using it as a tool
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
to assist, which is perfectly fine. But then there's an idea of just letting it do it for you, and and
Right.
and,
Yep.
and we could look at other things like that too, like GPS in a car.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
How many people don't know how to get anywhere right now?
Hmm.
That's a loss of knowledge. We're relying on something, but when it goes skitsy, we're like, oh, I don't know how to get there. I don't know how to read a map.
Right.
Um, so whether it's writing a essay that you don't know how to do because you never learned the basics, or if it's learning how to find directions if you don't have GPS, it's a loss, a great
Yeah.
loss of knowledge and
Right.
Yeah.
practicality.
Yeah. That's a awesome example. I love that one.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and I learned this, because when I like to drive, but I hate driving on the interstates, and GPS keeps you mostly on the interstate.
Hmm.
And I like to just like roam around. So a couple of summers ago, when I was driving back from Denver back to California, I accidentally left my atlas at home,
Mm.
and I realized, and I thought, oh, well, I'll just pick something up at a gas station, because the gas station, they always have maps. They
You fool.
don't
Do they? Do they?
anymore. They don't anymore. Um,
No, no,
you
why would
know,
they?
I did find one map, but it was about Native American sites in New Mexico. And that's how I ended up in Chaco Canyon
Oh.
a couple of summers ago. So I'm
So it
kind
was
of,
useful.
yeah, it was useful, but that's the only map I could find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Until I got to Denver, and I actually went to the tattered cover and picked up an atlas. Um, yeah. Um,
Yeah, but you used to be able to buy
yeah.
just
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
interstate maps for how
Yeah.
to get to A to B, and
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
no, they're
Yeah.
gone.
Right.
Yeah. But it would also show the back roads, and that's what I'm
Hmm.
interested in.
Hmm.
because that's where all the interesting stuff is.
Yep.
You don't see anything on the interstates. It's all on the back roads. Stephanie, you've driven with me. You know how I am. Oh,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes,
going
I
through.
do. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Now this is not a one of his myths, but there is a certain thing that Orr says that I think is important, and that is that we have confused data for knowledge.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
Yeah, because I think knowledge is in the interpretation,
Right.
kind of. Yeah,
And is
And it's
wisdom then the
layered.
application?
yeah.
Yeah, it's very layered too. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Hmm. Right.
it's not a you either know it or you don't type of thing.
Right. Right. Exactly. All right. Fourth myth: we can adequately restore that which we have dismantled.
Oof.
Oh boy, that's a good one for this age, isn't
Mhm.
it?
Yeah.
Given how
Where's
we're dismantling a lot of things.
yeah where's Musk's chainsaw?
Right.
Um,
Oh boy.
well, but in education, he sees that in the sense of um, disciplines and subdisciplines.
Can
And
you elaborate
what,
on that? I'm
huh?
sorry.
Yeah,
Can you
because
elaborate? Yeah.
what happens is, and this is actually one of the reasons that I love religious studies,
Hmm.
because religious studies is interdisciplinary.
Right.
Hmm.
Because religious studies, we look at religion, but it's not just about what people believe.
Right.
It incorporates sociology, it incorporates
Hmm.
history, it
Hmm.
incorporates anthropology, it incorporates philosophy, it incorporates theology, and probably a dozen other things that I'm not even thinking about right
Literature
now.
and music and
Literature,
all.
music, art,
Yeah.
humanities, right?
Yeah.
It's
Hmm.
interdisciplinary, but that's rare.
Right.
Most disciplines they're kind of myopic. They're like, okay, but this is what I'm looking at. And when they do that, they're not looking at the connections to other disciplines,
Right.
right?
Right.
So there's no integration of it.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, and this is also why, and this is what he points out, is that like if you study economics, you're only studying economics, but you never learn about like necessarily environmental issues. You never learn to incorporate the cost of soil degradation into
Right.
the price of
Yeah.
something, for example.
The hidden costs of things,
Yeah, because it's
and
so segmented, right? And it's
Right. Right.
that kind of myopic aspect.
and
Um,
I would argue that there's no reason for any discipline to be that myopic.
yeah,
Because it gives you so much more if you integrate cultural understandings of things into those subject matters, whether
Right. Right.
it's ethnicity or what they eat, or that all is going to play into it, and it can't be ignored as though every subject matter exists in its own bubble.
yeah.
Right.
I'm sorry, Steph, but I have to correct you again. We cannot look at ethnicities because diversity and equity and inclusion are now forbidden.
Well, I
So,
am on the DEI committee for my work stuff.
oh,
All right,
well,
so
Ooh.
when they take me away,
We'll know what happened.
yes,
you'll know what happened.
yeah. It's only what white people think now, man. Men,
White
white
men.
men.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Straight Christian men.
yeah. Under his eye. Um, fifth, fifth myth. Um, and I think this is where the quote comes from that I read.
Hmm.
The purpose of education is that of giving you the means for upward mobility and success.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And
we
this
know
is a
that one.
myth, people. Just remember, those listening, this is a myth.
Right. Well, and I think that it begs a question of, well, what do we mean by success?
Right.
Hmm.
What is a successful life?
Hmm.
Are you talking about the American capitalistic answer, or just in general?
Yeah. I mean, because our education system is predicated on the capitalist, industrial revolution, neoliberal answer to that question,
Right.
you know. But
Yeah.
what counts as success?
Hmm.
And I think that another way to answer, to ask this question is, what counts as a good life?
Right.
Yeah. And I think also because we have that myth, a lot of people get themselves into something that they later figure out they don't really want that.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's
Right.
like, but now you have all this debt. And now that you
Yeah.
have all this debt, how do you get out from under it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you feel trapped.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
Well, hopefully we'll get to student loan debt here. He actually has a quote here from Thomas Merton that I love,
mhm.
um, which was his advice to students was to, quote, be anything you like, be madmen, drunks, and bastards of every shape and form, but at all cost avoid one thing: success.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, because I
Hmm.
think we have a societal vision of what counts as success,
Right.
and
Hmm.
it's material.
Right.
Yeah,
And it neglects what it means to really be human, is my thought.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's where he then goes into, the plain fact is that the planet does not need more successful people.
Right.
Dot dot dot. Right.
And at the same token, we have to live in this world somehow.
We
Right.
do, we do.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So next, this is his final myth. Final myth is our culture represents the pinnacle of human achievement.
Yep. Yep.
No, I find us as having regressed.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, and it's something else you were talking about earlier. Kind of made me think of this is that we kind of think of ourselves as a society as we're so much more in the light than those ancient people were, or where they had these superstitions
Right.
and in some contexts that is accurate, but the whole thing, no, I we often think of ourselves as so much more advanced, but it also seems to me that we know far less,
Mm,
and we don't attribute some of the great successes of ancient societies
Right.
um, as being progressive when
right.
Right.
they had a
Mhm.
better understanding of things. It's like, as we pointed out, what we know today is so reliant on technology
Mm,
that I would say that any ancient culture knew far more about how to live in this world than we do.
yeah.
Right. Which
You
brings
know.
us back to an earlier comment about when we learn something, we lose something else.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, and I kind of want to say is not even necessarily ancient civilizations, but one of the things that I have students look uh, at mines, at least, was traditional ecological knowledge.
Hmm.
And this is with small scale societies.
Right.
And they have a relationship to their land, they
Hmm.
have a relationship to the ecology,
Hmm.
and it is not necessarily the way that we understand things, and
Hmm.
Right.
they have a holistic integral kind of view of things where they don't see the human as existing separately
Right.
from the natural world. And I think that there's this ongoing assumption, and this is, the assumption of modernity, going back
Hmm.
to Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, that
Hmm.
the natural world is just dead stuff,
Right.
Hmm.
that it's not a living thing, and that only humans have consciousness. And quite frankly, only I know that I have consciousness. As far as I know, the two of you are just robots. I don't know if you're conscious or not. But there are all these assumptions that go unquestioned. And that has led us to destroying the natural world because we don't see it as necessarily alive.
Hmm.
Right.
And traditional ecological knowledge is radically different than that.
Right.
Just one of the critiques of the transcendentalists, right?
Mm,
We don't incorporate the natural world into our understanding of how we should live in it,
yeah, yeah,
and we really should.
yeah,
You
Hmm.
know.
yeah.
Yeah.
But he also has here, he talks about this idea, this myth, that our culture represents the pinnacle of human achievement. I always liked, again, to refer back to Terence McKenna, that if you think that a 24-hour department store like Walmart with fluorescent lighting is the pinnacle of human achievement, you are so sorely wrong, right?
Yep.
Um,
Though, let's be
So
honest. I mean,
clearly, Target is.
yeah,
I I would really prefer that 24 hours again, because then I can go shopping when no one else is there.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
All right,
yeah.
just had to
Well,
put that out there.
but the other thing that I kind of threw McKenna in there, but what Orr says, and I think this is important: capitalism failed because it destroys morality altogether.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I think we've seen that clearly being
Hmm.
demonstrated
yeah.
in the past couple years.
Well, and it functions on keeping us unhappy.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're happy, we're not going to buy the garbage they want to try to feed us.
Hmm.
We have to be. It's this constant state of unhappiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So very quickly, I wasn't actually, when I thought about doing this episode, I wasn't thinking about this, but it is what it is.
Right.
Let's go through what he says education should be for.
Okay. That's great.
Number one, all education is environmental education.
Hmm.
Mm.
I think that needs a little elaboration.
He says here, I'll just read from his the text. Um, that we need to teach students that they are part of the natural world.
Yeah.
To teach economics, for example, without reference to the laws of thermodynamics or those of ecology, is to teach a fundamentally important ecological lesson that physics and ecology have nothing to do with the economy. That just happens to be dead wrong.
Right.
Everything needs to include the environment. We exist in the environment, and that's part of the problem, is that we think that culture is separate from environment.
Mm-hmm.
We are always in nature. Always.
Yeah, and it's certainly put us on a track of infinite growth that isn't possible, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply not advisable to view the world as just this commodified
Yeah.
Hmm.
place that
Right.
go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and it's not
Right.
even that, but it's like, the other example that I would use is there's this outstanding, I don't know what to call him. I'll just refer to him as a ecological historian, William Cronin. And he's got this amazing book that I think a lot of people would be like Snorefest, but it's called Nature's Metropolis. And what he
Okay.
does is he focuses on Chicago and how Chicago rose up from the land. But it doesn't exist it doesn't exist separately from the land.
Right.
And that most of the major cities in the United States are kind of connected to Chicago, historically speaking, through this transfer of energy of natural resources, through the riverways and lumber that becomes timber and all these other things. And we don't necessarily think about the origins of the United States, for example, being predicated on the natural resources,
Right.
Hmm.
even though it's right there. And we can look at the political philosophy with John Locke, who was really writing about the North American continent because he thought that it was a land of like endless resources,
Right.
versus Thomas Hobbes, who was arguing like, yep, nope, there's not enough to go around, right?
Hmm.
But the state of nature is there in the social contract, and it's there in the history of the nation. It's there in political philosophy. It's there in the history of the cities themselves. You
Right.
know, it's part of the economy. It is part of the literature. Look at the romantics. You can't have
Hmm.
romantic poetry without a love of nature. Um, it's there throughout, but we segregate it and ignore
Hmm.
it.
Right. And a similar thing could be
Hmm.
said about the social context as well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people think they're individuals operating independently of anything else going on around them as far as the
Yeah.
social context, and that's not true at all.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Um, I like this one, and so this is his second. Second principle comes from the Greek concept of paideia, which pedagogy comes from.
Mhm.
Hmm.
The goal of education is not mastery of subject matter, but of one's person.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
like that a lot.
Mm.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's something I say a lot to people when they try to ask me what art is, and I say, I am my art.
Yeah, you are
There's
a
no
work
other
of art,
answer.
Jeremy.
I am.
And to
I'm a
go
piece
with
of work.
that,
A piece of,
we've
sorry.
removed ourselves from the idea of pedagogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
School is very economically oriented, very commodified, so it's no longer about how we learn, how we um, embrace a topic and incorporate those ideas. It's, do we know the facts about it?
Right.
Do you know enough to do your job? Okay, move on.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons that I ended up doing my doctorate at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And my understanding of what counts as an integral education.
Hmm.
And I may be different than what the school says here. I don't think so, but I kind of connect it to Aristotle's vision of education, where education is not just about mind stuff, it's not just about
Hmm.
knowledge, but education's also about the individual.
Right.
And I always kind of say it's about the heart. It's about the
Hmm.
individual,
Hmm.
but it's also about the connection to the community.
Right.
And that a proper education is mind, heart, community.
Yeah.
That sounds socialist.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm fine with that. Um, Bernie would have won. Um,
Yep.
Third, knowledge carries with it the responsibility to see that it is well used in the world.
Mm.
Yeah, I think so. We need accountability.
Yeah, responsibility.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, Fourth, we cannot say that we know something until we understand the effects of this knowledge on real people and their communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what a detrimental effect it would have had on our current society to implement something like that. Because, and I use that in terms of capitalism,
Mm,
because it's we need to frame our knowledge and how we come about it in an ethical, communal way.
Right.
Um, I think about um, was it Carter's dream of having office for a cabinet position, actually, for ethical technology.
Hmm.
How do we implement it? Let's not just implement it. Let's see how this affects the world. And
mm,
gee, would we have Facebook? Would we have a lot of these platforms we have right now if we
Right.
had taken a moment to think about how it should be approached,
Yeah.
how we should implement this in our lives? And what we're seeing right now is tons of um, regret, on how these new technologies have affected us.
Mm,
um, how we are in our echo chambers now because we all have our own little understanding of the world that does not break that bubble.
right.
You know.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I think what we missed in terms of like the internet is there was a lot of hope at the beginning.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think that what we missed was the corporate ownership
Right.
and
Yeah.
how that would funnel information and connection. Um,
Hmm.
um, so yeah, but I agree totally with what you just said. Um, Fifth principle, um, and I'll have to explain this one. I think the importance of minute particulars and the power of examples over words.
Hmm.
So what he's kind of getting at here is, for example, if I'm teaching a philosophy class and um, I know that Trump would not approve, but we talk about justice, right? Because justice is
Right.
part of philosophy. You can't do philosophy without talking about justice and social justice and whatnot. So let's say I'm teaching a class about justice and fairness and so on and so forth. And I'm, at a college doing this. But yet, the college bookstore is selling T-shirts that are manufactured by essentially slave labor in, I don't know, Nicaragua or something. There is an inconsistency there.
Right.
And so the power of examples over words is to get the college bookstore to not sell T-shirts manufactured by oppressed or exploited communities.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But colleges tend not to do that.
No, they don't. It you might have some professors, instructors who point that out,
Yeah,
but certainly as an institution, yeah,
yeah,
that's not happening.
yeah. What Orr writes is students hear about global responsibility while being educated in institutions that often invest their financial weight in the most irresponsible things.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So essentially, I think another way of wording that is that colleges don't practice what they preach.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and likewise, if they're going to talk about justice, they should probably not rely on 70% of their college faculty to be adjunct college professors that have no job security or benefits.
Right.
That's part
Yeah.
of the education apocalypse. And I always like to kind of point that out because people still have this tendency to think that universities are the homes of this elite, ivory
Hmm.
tower elite. And it's like, no, these are people, and I'm one of them. Steph, you've been one of them, that we
Hmm.
have no job security. We have no benefits. We have to scramble around to find work to support ourselves, and
Right.
it limits what we can do and how we can do it.
Yep.
And also the idea that a lot of colleges have moved to, or in universities have moved to these uh, curriculum that uh, it's pre-designed,
Yeah,
you know, and the faculty don't have the ability to choose their textbooks, what lessons that they're going to teach. It's all pre-designed there. And in that respect, I have to ask, and I think you've asked this question as well, Nick, who then what's the point of going to a specific university
yeah,
that prides itself on a certain thing when you have adjunct professors who are working at 3, 4 schools and have a predetermined curriculum? Doesn't that make all the schools the same?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, what's the point of going to this one over that one
Well,
if you
it's
can't?
yeah, and that was my point in my experience is teaching community college in California.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I taught at I'm and at this point I'm fine with saying everything. Pasadena City College, which is considered one of the top 10 community colleges in the nation, and the I would also teach at East Los Angeles College, and radically different group of students. Pasadena was fairly diverse,
Mm-hmm.
but these were a little bit wealthier students. East Los Angeles College was like 75% Hispanic, about 20% Asian, and like 5% other. Usually from lower income. Students were not quite as prepared for college.
Mm-hmm.
But when I taught Introduction to Philosophy, I taught it the same at both schools. And I know that there were adjuncts who taught at UCLA. And I'm like,
Wow.
well, what's the difference? What's the difference between going to East Los Angeles or UCLA or Pasadena? If you're going to
Mm-hmm.
have the same person teaching the same class, what
Right.
it all boils down to then is branding.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so Pasadena City College, for example, in the philosophy department, they had three full-time positions in 3 years. And when you teach at community colleges, it's supposed to be based on excellence in instruction. It's not about research. It's not about publication. It's about being a
Mm-hmm.
good teacher. Not once in 3 years, in three positions, did they hire someone who'd been teaching for them.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And my response was, and I was a finalist once, didn't get it. And then the second time I didn't even get an interview. I got a
Yeah.
1 sentence response from HR that was, and this is burned into my brain, while the hiring committee was impressed by your qualifications, we have decided to pursue candidates that better meet the needs of the school. And my first response was, well, wait a minute. What do you mean better meets the needs of the school?
Mm-hmm.
How do I not meet the needs of the school? And then it just hit me. It was like, oh, I'm cheap, exploitable labor.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone that they hire, like a graduate from UCLA or whatever, it's all branding. They didn't care about the excellence in instruction. They didn't care. In fact, I was told that they were forbidden at looking at anyone they interviewed who had taught for them. Should they have interviewed anyone?
Wow.
They were not allowed to even look at their teaching experience at the school. They didn't care about excellence in instruction.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on, but I will stop that rant before it gets really ranty. But yeah, it's like, it doesn't matter. It's all about branding. It's all
Right.
about, what kind of shiny new buildings that we can present to students.
Mm-hmm.
With our copper roofs and so on and so forth. University of Denver. No, D is actually a good school, but that is the final thing that Orr has to say here. The way learning occurs is as important as the content of particular courses.
Right.
And he says this, and I could not help but to think of our alma mater here.
Uh-huh.
Campus architecture is crystallized pedagogy that often reinforces passivity, monologue, domination, and artificiality.
So we got to get Socrates on the rock, standing, teaching,
Yeah.
and get out of the institutions.
Yeah.
Just,
Well,
just,
I mean, as I was like compiling notes here, and I know that we usually only run like an hour and a half, and we've only got like 10 minutes to go. But as I was like compiling everything, it occurred to me, I'm like, you could do an entire podcast just on education,
Right.
and not run out of things to talk about. So we're just touching some of the surface. And, I did want to talk about the adjuncts. We've already done that. But let's talk about the last 10 minutes that we have, if you don't mind. Let's talk about student loans.
Oh, yes.
because I think this is part of the education apocalypse.
Oh
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So I have some statistics here as well. Student loan debt is the second highest consumer debt category after mortgages.
Wow.
Hmm.
Right now, my understanding is it is about $1.5 trillion.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I think it
Yeah.
is a bubble that is getting ready to burst.
Yes.
There were all of these repayment plans, and the current Congress is like, yeah, no, we don't like any of those. And they want to get them down to two, is my understanding, but I don't know what those two are. Um, uh, I think it's important to note a couple of things. One is that um, student loans, I think, are a sign of our class system that we aren't supposed to talk about in the United States.
Right.
Because if you
Hmm.
come from a wealthy family, you don't have to take out student loans. It's only the
Right.
Hmm.
lower and middle class, students that have to take out student loans.
Hmm.
Yep.
And initially, as I had mentioned before, these were zero interest. What's killing
Hmm.
people are the interest.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there have been many, many, many examples of students who've actually paid back what they've borrowed, but still owe like twice of
Yep.
what they borrowed.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The majority of student loan holders now, people who are repayment, are like me, over the age of 50.
Hmm.
They're trying to, and this gets into Linda McMahon. I don't like her, saying that they're going to garnish wages. They're going to garnish Social Security of
Wow.
people who are not paying back.
Yeah.
And student loans, I think, are the only kind of loan, the only kind of debt in this country that you cannot get. You can't. There's no bankruptcy protection
Correct. Correct.
at all.
Hmm.
And that is something that is in our Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. This is before the Bill of Rights, gives people bankruptcy protections. But that has
Yeah.
been stripped from student loans. And thank you, Joe Biden, for that, because he did that. He voted for that as a senator.
Hmm.
Um, and so there are groups there's one group in particular that I'm associated with, Student Loan Justice, that kind of lists some myths of student loan stuff,
Hmm.
and one of them is what they are going for is his focus right now, and this is Alan Culling, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, is to restore bankruptcy protections. But the
Mm.
Hmm.
other goal is to just have student loan debt wiped away, to have
Yeah.
it forgiven. And what he points out is that will cost taxpayers nothing.
Right. Right.
Because you hear that all the time is people are like, why I shouldn't have to pay for your college. And what that means is people are not recognizing that college is part of the common good.
Hmm.
And Linda McMahon has talked about worthless degrees, like philosophy or
Yeah.
supposedly religious studies, without recognizing that education, all of this is important.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. We are teetering very close to. I mean, maybe we're already off the cliff, but that's the idea that certain degrees aren't worthy of pursuit because they don't generate money. They're not good for capitalism.
Yeah.
Right.
And the fallacy there is extraordinary, that having knowledge in particular areas like philosophy, like religious studies, like music, enriches us
Hmm.
in ways that cannot be commodified, cannot be quantified. There's just so many ways that we become better people because of
Right.
those who pursue these paths. Um, and everyone's complaining that movies suck. Everyone's complaining that there's not any great books out there. And name for me the last time we've ever had a book that really just that it's a classic. It's going to just soar, and we're going to be remembering it 100 years from now.
Hmm.
We're just not producing these things any longer because we don't
Right.
value them. We don't have the education to address them. The the education in terms of education for its own sake.
Hmm.
It's not there.
Right. And I wouldn't say it's just for its own sake, because one of my things, my wife does research into mental health and the impact of art on adolescents with severe depression. And they found
Hmm.
categorically that if they can teach art to these students, they perform better and it sticks with them. And this is like
Hmm.
two week long course.
Hmm.
6 months later, they're still showing benefits from that course. If you have a well balanced, we could talk about mental health in the society, that's sort of a different question, but they function better as human beings. They're going to function better as employees. They're going to function better as citizens. They're going, and that can be quantified in certain ways. So
Hmm.
the fact that we're cutting all this out, we're cutting out a huge portion of our humanity, and in doing so, we're destroying our own society.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of studies that did show that art and music and those pursuits actually open up narrow pathways for us,
Right.
right? So that we can actually imagine more. We can actually perform better
Hmm.
across the board in all sorts of things because our mind has been opened. A
Hmm.
lot more color has been entered into it. So,
Right.
mhm.
Well, what do you expect coming from a woman who is one of the founders of the WWE?
I
that
did
is
see a
that is
video
an art form.
of her being body slammed.
I think I've seen that too, and I've watched it like
I was
over and
like,
over and over. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, she actually has a college degree,
in what?
French.
Well, here you
Useless
go.
degree.
Mm,
I guess she knows what she's talking about.
yeah,
Mhm.
but that's it. That's it. But mostly it's wrestling, and of course there is the whole issue of her husband Vince McMahon was a defendant lawsuit in regards to negligence to the Ring Boy scandal,
Right.
which is uh, uh, sexually assaulting young boys,
Hmm.
and she's been named in that of like looking the other way.
Right.
But I think that having some lawsuit against you is part of the job requirements for working in the Trump administration.
Right.
Um, and probably not
Yeah.
having any experience at all, like in education, to
Or,
run the Department of Education.
right.
You can't have any experience in what you're being given to run.
Hmm.
So
Which
that's,
gives much more credence to the idea that they're just out to dismantle everything.
oh,
Right.
yeah.
It's
Oh, yeah.
as we see education, the Department of Education has now been obliterated.
Right.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah. Um, but they're just taking a hard stance approach on trying to get that money out of student loans, people who can't afford it. And I saw mine. I was on an income-based repayment plan. I was paying like $415 a month, and I was notified. Even though I submitted my renewal, I was notified that my payments were going up by $1,300,
Oh my God.
which I cannot afford at all
Hmm.
in any way imaginable.
Right. I
Um,
mean, that's a mortgage payment.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Mhm.
and that's part of the problem. People talk about, it affects the rest of the economy. People are not buying
Right.
houses. They are like, well, why are we having kids? Who can afford it? Who can
Right.
afford a house? Who can afford a kid?
Well, if you give them
Yeah,
$5,000 per kid or whatever it is that the administration is proposing,
It
then
doesn't
they can
even
afford them, right?
matter.
I
Doesn't
know
even
it's
matter.
a drop in the bucket, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I was looking at the the real education apocalypse that is upon us is going to result in we're just not going to have professionals out there right now in the fields
Right.
doing anything
Yeah.
because we already have shortages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
We have medical shortages, we have teaching shortages, we have engineer shortages. And when you look at what's happening both with education and immigration, both of these things are going to cause an apocalyptic event in which we simply do not have the doctors, nurses, medical tech people, the lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
those people in those fields doing their thing, because the only people who are going to have degrees are those who can afford it.
Yeah,
Right.
And
exactly.
what is the likelihood that they're going to work for disadvantaged communities?
Yeah,
Hmm.
It's and you have to say that this is designed that way.
yeah,
They
Yeah.
can't not know that this is the result.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. And thank you for bringing us back home to the whole education apocalypse. Um, I didn't even get to quote that there have been 574 school shootings since 2000, but that's a whole other
Right.
issue, I think.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
that's another huge issue, but it
yeah,
is an educational issue, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's
for
Hmm.
sure. For sure.
Hmm.
if
So
you're
we've been doing this for 90 minutes. We usually keep these at 90 minutes. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. Um, and thank you both for all of this. I think there's been a lot, and we just skimmed the surface, I
Yeah.
think, on a lot of this. But I think the big takeaway is that we need a lot of reform in our
Hmm.
education from preschool up through college.
oh yeah.
And a lot of we have to think about our values a lot in
Hmm.
terms of college as a public good. I'm dating someone that is from Europe, and they got their undergraduate degree, I think, in Serbia, and their master's degree in Poland. They have zero college debt, and it
Yeah.
kills me. It absolutely kills me.
Hmm.
It's like um, yeah, I've served the public good for 20 years teaching, and
Right.
this is what I get. And
Mm.
I'm not alone in this. There are a lot of people in this
Yeah.
boat.
Right.
So let me ask you just if you have any final thoughts. Jeremy, we didn't have a recipe for you this week.
Yeah, it's okay.
Maybe you can share your Kill DeVille YouTube and whatnot,
Mm.
where people can go to get some awesome drink recipes.
Yeah, Kill Devil Rum and Cocktails. I'll put it in the comments down below,
Good.
just if anyone wants to check it out.
Yeah. And after hearing this, people probably are going to want to drink. So,
Right. Right.
um, and
Yeah. Here.
Steph,
Yeah. Yeah.
do you have I know you're on Facebook, any social media or anything else you'd like to share? You're also on Blue
I
Sky.
I am on Blue Sky, but I have restarted my blog at theaprilfool.com. April Fool is all one word, so you can catch me there.
Oh, awesome.
Hmm.
And you are an outstanding writer. So I'm happy to hear that you've done that.
Oh, thank you very
Yeah,
much.
yeah. So, and I'm all over Facebook and Blue Sky and was it Instagram, I guess. And mostly Rebel Spirit Radio, the podcast, and rebelspiritradio.com. And that's actually where you can find me on Facebook as well. There's a page for Rebel Spirit Radio. So, the two of you, thank you so much. This was
Thank you,
a
Nick.
fun
Thank you.
conversation, kind of. I think it
Well,
was an interesting and engaging one. I hope
right.
people enjoyed it. All right. Until the next time.
All right. See ya.
Cheers. All right, let's see here.